So when it comes to the French and Indian fur trade, there was one notable exception, a Frenchman named Jacques Cartier. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about him, but Cartier was an explorer and trader who gave France a leg up in the New World by exploring the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s. Cartier hoped the river might be a passage to Asia, an idea that never really seemed to die, even well into the 1700s and early 1800s. Although he didn't get far due to the river's rapids, his exploration laid the groundwork for future French claims in the region. Where the French really excelled in the 1500s, though, was in the fur trade, particularly in harvesting beaver pelts. Both the French and the English traded with local indigenous groups, offering European goods like hatchets and knives in exchange for valuable beaver fur. The beaver, a cold-weather mammal that lives in water, has incredibly dense fur, which was highly prized in Europe for making warm, luxurious hats. This fur trade would become the backbone of the French economy in the New World, and would play a crucial role in France's colonial ambitions in North America. So, while France might have been a latecomer compared to Spain, it found its niche in the fur trade and began laying the foundations for its future in the New World. With its large population, well-trained army, and growing knowledge of the land, France was gearing up to be a major player in the Americas, setting the stage for future conflicts with other European powers, especially the British. The beaver, an animal well adapted to cold water environments, developed an incredibly dense layer of fur with up to 1 million hairs per square inch. This unique fur effectively traps air, providing insulation and allowing the beaver to thrive in near-freezing water. This adaptation, while great for the beaver's survival, made its fur highly coveted in Europe, especially once it became known how soft and warm it was. As French and English explorers and merchants ventured into the colder regions of North America initially for fishing, they quickly realized the value of trading with local indigenous populations for beaver pelts. The Europeans would bring over simple goods like hatchets, knives, and metal cooking pots, items that were revolutionary to the indigenous peoples whose tools were primarily made from stone. For the indigenous people, a steel hatchet or a metal pot was a game changer, drastically improving their efficiency in daily tasks like chopping wood or cooking. This led to a lucrative trade for the French merchants. They could bring a small number of metal goods, trade them for large quantities of beaver pelts, and return to France to sell these furs at a high price to the European elite who had developed a craze for beaver fur hats, coats, and other garments. The profit margins were immense, as a single hatchet could be traded for a significant number of pelts, which in turn could be sold for a large amount of money in Europe. However, by the late 1500s, the French fur traders began facing increased competition. As word spread of the profitability of the beaver fur trade, more merchants, not only from France but also from England, started arriving in the same regions to trade. This influx of traders led to increased competition for the beaver pelts, which drove up the price. Indigenous groups, now more knowledgeable about the value of their furs, began demanding more in exchange for them. What once might have been a trade of one hatchet for 100 beaver pelts now became one hatchet for only 10 pelts, as English traders offered better deals or flooded the market. This competition squeezed profit margins for the French fur traders and set the stage for a more complex and competitive colonial economy in North America. It also foreshadowed the fierce rivalry that would develop between France and England in the New World, a rivalry that would play a significant role in shaping the future of the continent. Samuel Champlain played a pivotal role in reviving the French fur trade in North America during the early 1600s. As beaver populations on the Atlantic coast dwindled due to overhunting and increased competition with English traders, the profitability of fur trading began to decline significantly. Champlain, a French merchant with experience in the fur trade, recognized the need to explore new territories where beaver populations were still abundant. In 1607, Champlain presented his plan to the French king, proposing to establish a permanent settlement at the end of the St. Lawrence River, deep in the interior of North America. His strategy was twofold. Firstly, to tap into new, untapped beaver populations away from the overexploited coastal areas, and secondly, to create a stronghold that would preempt English traders from accessing these rich fur resources. With the king's approval, Champlain sailed to the New World and, in 1608, founded the city of Quebec. This settlement, unlike the contemporaneously established Jamestown by the English, was primarily focused on the fur trade. Quebec became a crucial trading post where Champlain and his men would receive shipments of goods from France, such as hatchets, knives, pots, and firearms, and then trade these goods with the local indigenous peoples for beaver pelts. Champlain's strategy proved to be highly successful. By moving the center of fur trading inland and establishing Quebec, the French were able to secure a steady and profitable supply of beaver fur, which continued to be in high demand in Europe. Champlain's efforts not only revitalized the fur trade, but also laid the groundwork for France's long-term presence and influence in North America. The success of Quebec demonstrated the effectiveness of establishing permanent settlements to control and sustain the fur trade, ensuring that France could continue to profit from this lucrative enterprise while keeping English competitors at bay. As the French fur trade expanded westward, Samuel Champlain and other French traders faced challenges similar to those on the Atlantic coast, such as the overhunting of beavers, leading to their local extinction. Champlain's response to the decline in beaver populations around Quebec was to push further into the interior of North America, establishing new outposts along major waterways to access untapped regions rich in fur-bearing animals. One of the first major expansions was the establishment of Montreal, which served as a critical trading hub after Quebec. Like Quebec, Montreal functioned as a center where French traders would exchange European goods, hatchets, pots, firearms, with local indigenous peoples for beaver pelts. Initially, this trade was highly profitable, but over time, the beaver populations around Montreal also began to dwindle due to overhunting, leading to a need for further expansion. This westward movement continued, with the French setting up small outposts along the Great Lakes and other major rivers. These outposts, often manned by just a few traders, would become the focal points for fur trading in the surrounding regions. The traders would establish relationships with local indigenous groups who would bring furs to these posts in exchange for European goods. As the French moved further west, they encountered new indigenous groups and ecosystems which they would exploit for the fur trade. The environmental impact of this trade was significant. As beavers were driven to extinction in various regions, the landscape changed dramatically. Beavers are natural dam builders, creating ponds and wetlands that support diverse ecosystems. When beavers were removed, these areas often turned into swamps or experienced altered water levels, which had cascading effects on the local environment. An interesting side note is the classification of beavers as fish by the Catholic Church, a move that allowed French fur traders and settlers to consume beaver meat during Lent. This classification was a pragmatic decision to support the fur trade, as it allowed traders to sustain themselves while observing religious practices. As French traders moved deeper into the interior, some chose to integrate into indigenous communities. These coureurs des bois, runners of the woods, would often marry into indigenous families, learn the languages, and adopt local customs. This integration helped them secure exclusive trading partnerships and navigate the complex social dynamics of the indigenous groups they traded with. For some, this life offered an escape from the rigid structures of European society, including the strictures of Catholicism. This westward push, driven by the need to continually find new beaver populations, laid the groundwork for the expansion of French influence across North America. The small outposts that began as trading forts eventually grew into major cities like Montreal and Detroit, with the fur trade serving as the backbone of French colonial expansion. The French fur trade not only reshaped the economy of the region, but also had lasting cultural and environmental impacts. The French fur trade in North America, while more cooperative and less land-intensive compared to the English colonization efforts, still had significant negative impacts on indigenous communities. Unlike the English, who densely populated and cultivated large swaths of land, often leading to violent conflicts with indigenous groups over territory, the French primarily focused on establishing small trading outposts. These outposts were scattered across vast regions, with relatively few French settlers involved. The French relied heavily on indigenous peoples to do the actual trapping and transport of furs, creating a more symbiotic relationship than the English. This dynamic led to what could be seen as a win-win situation at first. Indigenous groups, especially those in hunter-gatherer societies in the interior, gained access to European goods like metal, tools, firearms, and clothing, which significantly improved their quality of life. The beaver, which had been of limited use to these groups before, became a valuable trade commodity, allowing them to acquire items that were previously unavailable. However, this relationship wasn't without its downsides. One of the most devastating impacts of European contact, even in the more cooperative French model, was the introduction of diseases like smallpox. As French fur traders pushed into the interior of the continent, they unknowingly brought with them diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity. These diseases spread rapidly, causing massive depopulation and social disruption among tribes that had previously been untouched by earlier waves of European-born illnesses. In addition to disease, the French also introduced alcohol to indigenous communities, which proved to be another devastating influence. Unlike the Spanish, who imposed restrictions on what could be traded with indigenous peoples, specifically avoiding the sale of firearms and alcohol, the French had fewer qualms about such trade. Alcohol, in particular, had a profound and destructive impact on many indigenous groups. These communities, some of which had never engaged in agriculture and thus had no prior experience with alcohol, were suddenly exposed to spirits without any societal norms or biological tolerance for it. This led to widespread alcoholism, social breakdown, and other forms of devastation within these communities. Recognizing the harm caused by alcohol, the French authorities eventually attempted to regulate its trade, making it illegal to sell alcohol to indigenous peoples. However, enforcement was difficult, especially in remote areas where fur traders operated far from any oversight. The introduction of alcohol remained a significant and lasting negative consequence of the French fur trade. Overall, while the French approach to colonization in North America involved less direct conflict over land and a more cooperative relationship with indigenous peoples, it still resulted in substantial negative impacts, particularly through the spread of disease and the introduction of alcohol. These effects, combined with the overhunting of beavers and the environmental changes that followed, highlight the complex and often harmful legacy of the fur trade in North America. The French fur trade, while primarily economic, also had significant cultural and social impacts on both the indigenous populations and the French themselves. One of the most profound effects of the fur trade was the introduction of firearms to indigenous groups. The French, unlike the Spanish, who avoided trading weapons with indigenous peoples, freely exchanged firearms for beaver pelts. This trade fundamentally altered the power dynamics among indigenous groups. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy, one of
5 words you pronounce wrong 2 years before your brain starts shutting down. Dementia is now known as type.
The first groups to engage in the fur trade with the French gained access to firearms and other European goods earlier than many of their neighbors. This technological advantage allowed the Iroquois to expand their territory aggressively. As they exhausted the beaver populations in their own lands, they used their superior weaponry to conquer neighboring tribes, seizing their beaver-rich territories to continue trading with the French. This led to an arms race among indigenous groups, as those without firearms were at a severe disadvantage, leading to increased violence and territorial conflicts. While the fur trade fueled French expansion, it did not lead to large-scale French settlement in North America. Unlike the English colonies, which were densely populated and focused on agriculture, the French presence was characterized by small outposts and trading forts scattered across a vast territory. These outposts required only a few French settlers, relying heavily on indigenous peoples to supply the furs. Consequently, French colonial expansion was less about land acquisition and more about controlling strategic points along trade routes. In addition to fur traders, French missionaries also ventured into North America, aiming to spread Catholicism among indigenous populations. However, their efforts were met with limited success. Unlike Spanish missionaries, who sometimes succeeded by offering goods and protection in exchange for conversion, French missionaries faced significant resistance. Indigenous groups often saw little incentive to adopt Christianity or settle in French missions when they could obtain European goods through the fur trade without abandoning their traditional ways of life. Furthermore, the phenomenon of fur traders going native complicated missionary efforts. Many French traders adopted indigenous customs, married indigenous women, and integrated into indigenous societies. This cultural assimilation made it difficult for missionaries to persuade indigenous people to adopt French customs and religion, as the traders' success without conversion undermined the missionaries' message. The introduction of firearms, the limited success of missionary work, and the cultural exchanges between French traders and indigenous peoples all highlight the complex and often unintended consequences of the fur trade. While the French maintained relatively peaceful relations with indigenous groups compared to the English, the fur trade still brought significant challenges and changes to indigenous societies, altering their social structures, territorial boundaries, and ways of life.